from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that freezing Texas road and the woman nobody expected to survive the night. The baby had been crying for 40 minutes straight. Abigail Moore knew because she had been counting. Counting was something she did when panic tried to swallow her whole. She counted breaths. She counted steps. She counted the minutes between her son's cries to track whether they were getting worse or better. Tonight they were getting worse. Shh, she whispered against the top of his head, tucking him deeper under the left side of her coat. Her coat was 3 sizes too large, bought from a church donation box in Abilene 6 weeks ago, and it smelled like someone else's laundry. It was the best thing she owned. Shh, baby, Mama's got you. Mama's right here. He didn't believe her, couldn't blame him. She barely believed herself. The Greyhound had broken down 11 miles outside of a town she didn't even know the name of. The driver had announced it with the flat, apologetic tone of a man who'd delivered this particular piece of bad news enough times that it no longer surprised him. Mechanical failure. Someone would come. Probably an hour, maybe 2. Most of the passengers had cell phones. Most of them called someone. Most of them had somewhere to go. Abigail had a duffel bag, a diaper that needed changing badly, and $43 folded inside her left shoe. She had waited. She had watched the other passengers slowly get collected: a pickup truck for an older couple, a sedan for a woman with 2 kids, a van for a group of young men who'd laughed the entire time they waited. One by one, the road emptied. The driver had looked at her twice with something she recognized as pity and something she hated as helplessness, and then he too had climbed into a passing trucker's cab and disappeared into the dark. She had waited another 20 minutes after that, because she was still the kind of woman who believed things would work out if you were patient enough. Then the sleet started. Not rain, not snow. Sleet the kind that came in sideways and found every gap between your collar and your neck, between your sleeve and your wrist, between who you used to be and who you were now. Her son screamed harder when the first wave hit, and Abigail turned her body into a wall between him and the weather and started walking. She didn't know which direction was toward town. She picked the direction the other cars had come from and put one foot in front of the other. Her boots were wrong for this. Everything about her situation was wrong for this. The duffel bag strap cut into her shoulder with every step, and she shifted it constantly, left side, right side, left side again, while her free arm held her son against her chest, and her legs moved through mud that was trying its level best to hold her in place. "We're almost there," she told him. She had no idea if that was true. She had been walking for almost 30 minutes when her left ankle folded underneath her on a patch of ice hidden beneath a shallow puddle. She went down hard, shoulder first, hip second, and the shock of the ground knocked the breath out of her completely. Her first thought, even before the pain registered, was to check her son. She held him up in both hands like an offering, her own body flat against the frozen ground, and looked at his face in the dark. Still crying, still warm, still breathing. She dropped her head back against the mud and laughed, a short, broken, slightly hysterical sound that the storm immediately swallowed, because sometimes laughing was the only thing left that made any sense. Then she tried to get up. Her left ankle disagreed. She made it to one knee. She made it to a crouch. She grabbed the fence post nearest to her, a rough wooden post strung with barbed wire that bit into her palm, and she accepted it. She accepted the pain, the way she had learned to accept most things, quietly and without complaint. And she hauled herself upright. She stood there for a moment, swaying slightly. Her son pressed against her chest, the sleet coming down harder now, and she looked down the fence line into the darkness and made herself say it out loud. "Okay," she said. "Okay. We keep going." She made it approximately 40 more steps before her body simply stopped cooperating. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It wasn't the way they showed it in the pictures, a graceful slide to the ground with one hand extended. It was a slow, grinding, ungraceful process of her legs refusing to hold her weight and her arms wrapping around her son and her side finding the earth with the tired inevitability of something that had been trying to stay upright for far too long. She pulled her coat tighter around the baby. She told herself she was just resting, She told herself she would get up in a minute. The sleet kept coming down. Ethan Calloway had not planned to check the north fence line that night. He had planned to eat the last of the cold cornbread sitting on the kitchen counter, drink half a cup of coffee, and go to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 3 weeks. His youngest Samuel had a bad cough that had been keeping them both up, and the only way Ethan could get the boy to sleep was to stay in the rocking chair beside his bed until the breathing evened out, which usually took the better part of an hour. Tonight, Samuel had gone down easier than usual, and Ethan had stood in the doorway of his son's room for a long moment, watching the small chest rise and fall, and felt the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from being the only adult in a house that used to have two. He'd grabbed his coat and gone outside because he needed air that wasn't full of something he couldn't fix. He checked the cattle out of habit, counted them the way he always did, a running number in the back of his mind that had been there so long it felt like breathing. He was walking the fence line back toward the house when his lantern caught something on the ground that wasn't fence post and wasn't mud. He stopped. He held the lantern out. He saw a woman lying against the base of his fence with a baby coat tucked against her chest and her arm wrapped around it like a shield. "Lord Almighty," Ethan said very quietly. And then he was running. He dropped to one knee beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her neck and felt a pulse strong enough, steady enough, and then he put his hand near the coat and felt the warmth beneath it and heard a small, tired, furious sound that told him the child was alive and unhappy about the current situation. "Ma'am." He touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" "Nothing." "Ma'am, I need you to wake up. My name's Ethan Calloway. You're on my property, and I'm going to help you, but I need you to look at me first." Her eyelids moved. That was something. "That's it," he said. "Come on now. Open your eyes." She opened them, dark eyes wide with confusion, and then immediately sharp with fear, the kind of sharp that came from someone who had learned to assess a situation for danger before they were fully conscious of being in it. Her arm tightened around the bundle in her coat. "My baby." "He's fine," Ethan said. He had assumed it was a he, and he turned out to be right. "He's warm. He's crying, which means he's got good lungs on him. You're the one who needs attention right now." She was already trying to sit up. "Easy," he said. "Easy. You went down hard. You might have something twisted." "I have to." She stopped, looked around, seemed to be calculating something. "How far is town?" "Far enough that you're not walking there tonight in this weather." He sat back on his heels and looked at her straight. She was a big woman, broad-shouldered, round-faced, the kind of build that looked like it had been built for endurance rather than speed. And she was soaked through and shaking, and there was a cut on her palm from something sharp that had gone unaddressed long enough to be worrying. "I have a house a 1/4 mile up this fence line. I'd like to take you there and get you dried out and looked at." She looked at him the way women who had learned not to trust easy offers looked at them. "I don't need charity," she said. "That's fine," he said. "You can pay me back however you see fit. Right now what I need you to do is let me help you stand up." She thought about it for a second that felt much longer than a second. Then she took his hand. His house was nothing like she had imagined from the outside. She hadn't imagined much. She'd been focused on staying upright and keeping her son's head dry beneath her coat. But walking through the door of the Calloway ranch house, even half frozen and limping, Abigail noticed things the way she always noticed things, which was immediately and in detail. The kitchen was enormous and dead. A large iron stove cold. A table that seated 8 set for 2. Pots hanging from a ceiling rack with the particular dullness of things that had not been used in some time. A shelf of canned goods arranged without system labels facing every direction. A smell that was less food and more the memory of food, old grease and wood smoke, and something like resignation. A teenage girl appeared in the doorway to the hall. She was maybe 16, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes. Abigail didn't know that yet, but she would learn it later, and she looked at Abigail with the specific, undisguised assessment of someone who had decided what they thought before they'd seen the full picture. It was a category. Found her on the north fence line, Ethan said. He was already moving to the stove, striking a match, coaxing heat from something that clearly hadn't been asked for heat in a while. She needs warming up. Baby does too. Baby, Claire repeated. Abigail had pulled her son from inside her coat and was holding him against her chest, bouncing him very slightly, the automatic motion of a woman who had been doing it long enough that it required no conscious thought. He had stopped crying in the warmth of the house and was now making the suspicious investigative sounds of a baby, deciding whether or not to trust his current situation. Boy or girl? Claire asked. Boy, Abigail said. His name is Isaac. Claire looked at Isaac. She looked at Abigail. She looked at the duffel bag dripping muddy water onto her kitchen floor. You got a husband somewhere? Claire. Ethan's voice had a single note of warning in it. It's a fair question, Daddy. It's a question for another time. He turned from the stove. Miss... He paused. Waited. Moore, Abigail said. Abigail Moore. Miss Moore needs dry clothes and something hot to drink. You want to help me find something in your mother's trunk, or do you want to stand there and ask questions? Claire's expression did something complicated, closed and opened in rapid succession. The mention of the mother pulling something through her that she didn't want visible. She looked at Abigail one more time, long and measuring, and then she turned and walked down the hall without a word. Abigail looked at Ethan. I'm sorry, she said. For the trouble. You didn't cause the weather, he said. He pulled a chair close to the stove and gestured to it. Sit. Keep him warm. She sat. She watched him move around the kitchen, with the practiced, economical movements of a man who had learned to cook out of necessity rather than pleasure. He filled a pot with water. He found a tin of something in the back of a cabinet. He worked without asking her questions, which was either courtesy or distraction, and she was grateful for both. Your ankle, he said without turning around. It'll be fine. You're favoring it. I favor a lot of things. He glanced back at her. Something almost like a smile moved across his face, and then decided against committing. You want me to look at it or not? I'd rather look at your kitchen, she said, and she wasn't being difficult. She meant it. She was already looking at the cold stove he'd lit, at the sad arrangement of cans at the table that was dusty along the far end where nobody sat anymore. How long since someone cooked a real meal in here? The question surprised him. She could see it in the way his shoulders changed. A while, he said. How many people does this ranch feed? Why? Because there are 6 cast iron pans hanging from that rack, and the largest one has been used recently and the others haven't. Which means whoever's cooking now is using one pan and making something simple probably once a day, and the people eating it are getting enough to live but not enough to feel like they matter. She paused. How many? He was quiet for a moment. 8 ranch hands, he said. My 2 kids, me. She nodded slowly. She looked at the shelf of canned goods again. She ran the math the way she always ran it, instinctive fast, the kind of calculation that didn't require paper. Let me cook, she said. He turned all the way around then. Ma'am, just one meal. She met his eyes. She kept her voice level because this mattered, and she needed him to hear it as a business proposition rather than desperation, even though it was partially both. Let me cook one meal for your family. All of them. Tomorrow, if that's easier. And if it's not worth the food I use, I'll leave. I'll take my boy and my bag, and I won't ask you for anything else. Ethan Calloway looked at her for a long time. You got a place to be, he finally said. Not tonight, she said honestly. He turned back to the stove. We eat at 6, he said. Ranch hands eat first, then the kids and me. Abigail breathed for the first time since the bus broke down. I'll need to know what you have, she said. And I'll need the whole pantry, not just the shelf I can see. Claire came back with dry clothes and the particular hostility of a teenager doing a generous thing against her own better judgment. She dropped a folded stack on the table, a large flannel shirt, that had been a man's, a pair of wool socks, a heavy skirt that had once been her mother's, and that she held by the very edge of the fabric, and she did not look at Abigail while she set them down. "Bathroom's down the hall on the left," she said. "There's a crib in the storage room. Daddy set it up when we were using it for the Harmon baby last spring." She hesitated, then very quietly, almost under her breath, "It's clean." "Thank you," Abigail said. Claire lifted her chin. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because Isaac is a baby, and he doesn't have a choice about what his mother does." "That's fair," Abigail said. Claire seemed thrown by that. She'd expected argument or apology, or the particular kind of grateful submission that people offered when they felt they had no standing. Abigail offered her none of those things, just a simple, honest agreement that her position was reasonable, and the girl didn't know what to do with it. She left without saying anything else. Abigail found the bathroom. She changed into the dry clothes and stood in front of the small mirror for a moment, looking at herself the way she rarely allowed herself to look honestly, without the protective distance she'd learned to maintain. She was large in a way that this world had never once let her forget, and she had spent years trying to shrink herself in every possible direction, quieter, smaller, less present, less visible, less of a burden. She looked at her face in that mirror, pale and drawn and exhausted, and she made herself a single promise, in the cold of someone else's bathroom. No more shrinking. She had a child to raise. She had a kitchen to work with. She would earn her place here the only way she'd ever known how to earn anything, with her hands. Isaac slept in the old crib with a surprising willingness, as if he understood that tonight they'd landed somewhere solid and intended to take advantage of it. Abigail spent an hour after midnight in the kitchen with a single candle and a ledger page she'd found in a kitchen drawer, making a list. What she had: 24 eggs, a large sack of cornmeal that had been kept dry, salt, a partial jar of bacon, drippings, canned tomatoes, 12 cans, stacked good brand, dried beans, a ham bone with a fair amount of meat still clinging to it, dried onion, something that might have been rosemary if you were feeling generous, flour lard, a small tin of molasses, and 3 kinds of dried peppers hanging from a hook she'd found in the back of the pantry. What she didn't have much, but she had been working with not much her entire life. She sat at the kitchen table with her candle and her list and began to plan. Red beans, ham bone broth, cornbread, real cornbread, not the pale, crumbling thing she'd seen the remnants of in the cold cast iron with drippings folded in and the crust done hard. She'd do the tomatoes into something that could pour over the top, give it brightness, give it life. She'd do the eggs scrambled for the little ones and hard-fried for the workers who needed them that way. She'd do a molasses glaze on what was left of the ham. It would be humble. It would be honest. It would be real. She wrote it all down in her small, deliberate handwriting, and then she sat back and looked at the kitchen around her. The dead stove, now warming the empty table. The pans she was going to put to use for the first time in months. And she thought about all the kitchens she had fed people in, all the tables she had brought back to life, all the times the only thing she'd had to offer was this. A meal. A reason to sit down together. A place where for 30 minutes, nothing outside the walls mattered as much as what was on the plate in front of you. It wasn't a small thing. People always talked about it like it was a small thing. She knew better. At 5:30 in the morning, while the ranch was still dark and the hands were still in their bunkhouse, Ethan Calloway came downstairs to find his kitchen already awake. He smelled it before he reached the bottom step. Something deep and heavy and warm beans that had been simmering for hours, smoke and ham, and the particular sweetness of molasses hitting a hot pan. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked. Abigail had both the large stove and the smaller oven going. Isaac was asleep in a padded crate she'd made from a wooden box and a folded blanket set close to the warm stove, but not near enough to worry about. She had her back to Ethan, stirring something in the largest pot, wearing his dead wife's skirt and the flannel shirt, and her hair pinned back with 2 forks she'd apparently recruited from the drawer. She didn't hear him come in. "Miss Moore," he said. She didn't startle. She turned with the composure of someone who had learned to always be aware of a room even with her back to the door. "Cornbread's got another 20 minutes, she said. "Beans are done. I need to know if your workers take their eggs any particular way." He looked at the pots. He looked at the counter, which she had organized into a working system that had not existed 12 hours ago. He looked at Isaac in his improvised bed. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he said. "Everywhere," she said. "And nowhere. You learn when you have to." She turned back to the stove. "Your workers. Eggs. Most of them will eat whatever's in front of them. That tells me nothing about what they'd like." He pulled a chair out and sat down at the kitchen table, sat in it rather than past it, which was different, and she registered the difference. "Jimmy Pace likes his fried. Pete Harlow takes scrambled. The rest don't complain. Do they eat together or separate?" "They eat at the bunkhouse table. I bring a pot over." "Not today," she said. He looked at her back. "No, not today," she said again, and there was something in her voice that was not a request. "Today, they eat at this table. All of them. With you." Ethan Calloway sat with that for a moment. "They won't like being told. They'll like the food," she said. "And they'll like sitting in a warm kitchen more than a cold bunkhouse, even if they won't admit it. Men who work outside always do." She glanced back at him. "When's the last time they ate in this house?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Go get them," she said. "Breakfast in 40 minutes. He stood up slowly. He looked at her for a moment, this large, calm, exhausted woman who had been unconscious on his fence line less than 8 hours ago and was now reorganizing his household like she'd been hired for the job and knew exactly what she was worth. "You always this direct with people who took you in out of a storm," he said. "I'm this direct when I know what I'm doing," she said. "Do you want a good breakfast for your workers or not?" He put his hat on. "I'll go get them," he said. He paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for this." Abigail didn't turn around, but something in her shoulders changed, eased just slightly, the way a knot loosens the first time it's touched with intention. "You haven't tasted it yet," she said. "Thank me after." He walked out into the cold morning. Behind him, the kitchen stayed warm and lit and working, which was something it had not been in a very long time, and somewhere in the sound of that simmer and that crackle was the first fragile beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. But the house could feel it. Houses always know first. 8 ranch hands was not what Abigail had pictured when Ethan said 8 ranch hands. She had pictured men who came in quietly, sat down, ate what was put in front of them, and left. She had pictured manageable. She had pictured easy. What walked through the kitchen door at 6:15 that morning was something closer to a controlled disaster. Big men with muddy boots and loud opinions, and the specific social hierarchy of people who had eaten together long enough to have assigned seats that nobody ever discussed out loud, but everybody respected completely. They filled the kitchen the way weather fills a room all at once, and with force, and 3 of them stopped dead when they smelled the food and looked around like men who had walked into the wrong house. "The heck is going on in here?" said the one closest to the door. He was broad across the shoulders, with a red beard and the permanently suspicious expression of a man who had been disappointed by optimism before. Jimmy Pace Abigail would learn, the one who liked his eggs fried. "Breakfast," Ethan said behind them all. "We always eat at the bunkhouse." "Not today." Jimmy looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Jimmy. She was already moving, pulling the cornbread from the oven, setting it on the iron trivet she'd found in the back of a drawer, splitting it with a single clean cut. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, but clearly. Jimmy did not sit down. "Who are you?" "The woman who's been up since 4 in the morning cooking your breakfast," she said. "You can ask better questions after you eat. Eggs. Fried," he said automatically, then seemed annoyed that he'd answered. "That's what I thought." She turned back to the stove. There was a moment of silence behind her that she'd learned to read the way other people read whether the specific quality of 8 men deciding whether to be difficult or hungry, and hunger winning the way it always did. Chairs scraped. Bodies settled. The kitchen table had not held this many people in longer than any of the furniture could say, and it groaned slightly in adjustment, which Abigail chose to take as appreciation rather than complaint. She put food on the table the way she always had, not plate by plate, but in the center, family-style bowls of beans and a platter of cornbread and a cast-iron pan of eggs, done 2 different ways with a folded piece of cloth. Noting which side was which, because she had learned that men who worked hard with their hands felt the small dignities more than they would ever admit. She set the tomato sauce in a small pot with a ladle. She placed the molasses-glazed ham last in the center of everything, because a centerpiece matters, even when nobody calls it that. Then she stepped back, picked up Isaac from his box. He'd been making the low warning sounds of a baby approaching hunger, and she sat at the far end of the table with her son in her lap and watched them eat. Pete Harlow was the first one to stop talking. He'd been saying something to the man beside him about a fence post on the south property, something that needed fixing before the next freeze, and then he put a spoonful of beans in his mouth and the sentence simply ended. He chewed. He looked down at his bowl. He took another spoonful. "Lord," he said, quietly, like a man in church. Jimmy Pace had already finished his eggs and was working on his second piece of cornbread with the focused intensity of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. He reached for the tomato sauce without looking up, poured it, took a bite, and said nothing at all, which Abigail had learned long ago was often the better compliment. Ethan sat at the head of the table and watched his ranch hands eat with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and something older than surprise. Something that had been waiting a long time for this exact thing and hadn't known what to call the waiting. Claire came downstairs at 6:30. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the table full of men and the woman at the end of it, and the baby in the woman's lap, and her face did the thing it had done the night before, closed fast like a door. "There's a seat," Abigail said, "between your father and Pete." "I eat in my room," Claire said. "Not this morning," Ethan said. Claire's jaw tightened. She crossed the kitchen without looking at anyone and sat down between her father and Pete Harlow, who shifted his bowl slightly to give her room in the automatic, unthinking way of a man who'd been taught to make space. She looked at the food on the table for a long moment. She served herself a small portion of beans. She took one bite of cornbread. Something moved across her face then fast, and she controlled it fast, but Abigail caught it. The kind of expression a person makes when something tastes the way a memory feels, like being somewhere you loved before you knew you loved it. Claire set the cornbread down and did not pick it up again, and did not look at anyone for the rest of the meal. But she cleaned her bowl. Abigail noticed that too. It was Jimmy Pace who broke the silence that settled after the eating was mostly done, the comfortable silence of people who had been fed properly, which is its own particular kind of peace. "Where'd you come from?" he said. He was looking at Abigail directly now, the suspicion not gone, but complicated by the fact that she'd just fed him better than he'd eaten in months. "East," she said. "East where?" "Wherever I was before here." He watched her. "You running from something." The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when someone asks the question that everyone was thinking. "I'm sitting in this kitchen feeding your breakfast," Abigail said evenly. "Does it look like I'm running?" Jimmy chewed. "Kinda." "Jimmy," Ethan said. "It's all right," Abigail said. She looked at Jimmy with the kind of steadiness that took years to grow. "I had some trouble behind me. I'm working on what's in front of me. That's all I'm prepared to say about it." Jimmy held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the particular respect men like him offered to people who gave them a straight answer instead of a story. "Fair enough," he said. He pushed back from the table and picked up his plate and carried it to the sink, which was not something that had ever happened at a meal in this house before, not since the death of the woman whose plates they were eating off. The man behind him did the same, and then another, and then all 8 of them, a quiet procession of men putting their own dishes in the sink before they went back out into the cold morning, and the last one out, a young man with dark hair whose name Abigail didn't learn until later, turned in the doorway and said, "That was real good, ma'am." "Thank you," she said, Same time tomorrow. He blinked. Then he smiled, surprise genuine, the smile of someone who had not expected to be offered tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. He left. Ethan was looking at her. I didn't agree to tomorrow, he said. No, she said. She was already standing, settling Isaac against her shoulder, beginning to clear the remaining dishes with her free hand. But you didn't disagree either. He was quiet for a moment. The pantry needs restocking, he said. I made you a list, she said. It's on the counter. He found the list. He looked at it for a long moment. It was thorough, organized by category with rough prices noted beside each item based on what she'd seen at stores she'd passed through. You always plan this far ahead, he said. I plan as far as I need to, she said. Right now I need 3 days. After 3 days I'll know what else this kitchen needs. Ethan folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll go to town this afternoon, he said. She nodded. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like something worth coming home to, and he looked at Isaac in Abigail's arms. The small, serious face, the dark eyes that were starting to explore the room with the greedy curiosity of a child who had very recently figured out that the world was larger than one coat, and something crossed Ethan's face that he didn't let land anywhere visible. How old? He said. 6 weeks, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. Don't let Claire give you trouble, he said. Claire's not giving me trouble, Abigail said. Claire's grieving. There's a difference. Ethan stopped with his hat halfway to his head. He didn't say anything. He put his hat on and walked out. Abigail listened to his boots on the porch, and then the quiet of the house settling back around her, and she looked at the kitchen, the cleared table, the dishes in the sink, the stove that was still warm, and she let herself have 20 seconds of something that might have been relief. Then she started on the dishes. She had work to do. By the end of the first week, Abigail had reorganized the kitchen pantry into a system that made sense. Repaired the door on the dry storage cabinet that had been hanging crooked on one hinge. Taught Isaac to sleep in the crib through the night by sheer patient repetition. Established a breakfast routine that had the ranch hands arriving 4 minutes early, out of a habit they would have denied forming, and started a slow-simmered beef broth that she kept going on the back of the stove and added to every day a base from which she could build anything. She had not asked for a wage. She had not asked for permanence. She had not asked for anything beyond what she needed to do the next meal, the next day, the next thing. This was the way Abigail moved through the world, not looking too far ahead, because looking too far ahead meant seeing all the ways it could go wrong, and she had spent enough of her life in that particular darkness. What she had not expected was Claire. Claire came into the kitchen on the 4th evening while Abigail was feeding Isaac and pretended to be looking for something on the pantry shelf. She stood with her back to the room for a long, unconvincing moment, moving jars around without purpose. She used to make biscuits on Sundays, Claire said, not looking at her. My mother. The whole house smelled like it by 8 in the morning. Abigail didn't say anything. Your cornbread isn't biscuits, Claire said, still not looking. I'm not saying it is. I know, Abigail said, but it's not bad. The words cost her visibly. Isaac likes the kitchen. Most babies do, Abigail said. Warm and full of sound. It's comfortable. Claire turned around. She leaned against the pantry door and looked at Isaac with the complicated expression of a teenager who had decided she wasn't going to care about something and was losing that particular argument with herself. How come you know so much about cooking? She said. Started when I was 8, Abigail said. My grandmother. She didn't teach me because she thought it was important for a woman to know. She taught me because she said a person who can feed people is never truly powerless. She looked at Claire. She was right. Claire absorbed this. Were you always? She stopped. Abigail waited. Did people ever? She stopped again, frustrated, and whatever she'd been trying to ask went back down wherever it came from. Never mind. You can ask it, Abigail said. I won't be offended. I wasn't going to ask anything. Okay. Silence. Were you always big? Claire said. Quiet. Almost defiant the way questions sound when you're bracing for the shame of asking them. Yes, Abigail said simply. And people were awful about it. Some, Abigail said. Enough. And you just kept going. What else was I going to do? Claire looked at her for a long moment. Really looked the way she hadn't since the first night the assessment she'd shut down fast, replaced now with something more honest and less comfortable. I don't know if I trust you, Claire said. That's fine, Abigail said. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Abigail looked at her son in her arms, then back at Claire. Right now, she said. Nothing. But if you ever want to learn to make those biscuits your grandmother's way, or a new way, or whatever way you want, the kitchen will be here. Claire's chin went up. I know how to make biscuits, she said. I know you do. She left. But she left slower than she'd arrived, and that was something. It was Pete Harlow who mentioned it first on the Thursday of the second week. He came into the kitchen early before the others and sat down at the end of the table where Abigail was nursing Isaac in the quiet before the rush. You know, he said, the Hendersons up the road asked me this morning where the Calloway Ranch was getting their meals catered from. Abigail looked at him. What did you tell them? I told them we had a cook. He paused. They asked if she'd consider doing Sunday dinners. Their church group. 20 people, maybe 25. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's not my decision, Abigail said. No, Pete agreed. But it could be a conversation. She thought about that for the rest of the day. About 25 people. About what 25 people sitting down to a real meal meant in terms of what she'd need, what she could charge, what it would mean for the ranch financially if the kitchen became something that gave back instead of just taking. She thought about it while she stirred and tasted and adjusted and fed her son and put him down and picked him up again. She was thinking about it that evening after supper when the sound of a vehicle on the gravel road made her still her hands on the counter. Not the sound of Ethan's truck, which she'd learned by the particular rattle of the left panel that had a loose bolt. This was different, heavier, slower. The deliberate creep of something that wasn't passing through but arriving. Isaac was asleep. The kitchen was quiet. She moved to the window and looked out into the dark, and the dark showed her a black truck idling at the edge of the cattle gate, its headlights off its engine, just barely audible, like something that was trying very hard not to be seen. She stood very still. Her hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She knew that truck. She had spent 4 years watching for it in the rearview mirror of every car she'd ever borrowed, every bus she'd ever taken, down every highway that might or might not have been far enough away. She had told herself, had promised herself and Isaac in the dark of too many bad nights, to count that she had finally gotten far enough. She looked at the black truck at the end of the Calloway gate. She looked at her sleeping son, and she understood with the sick absolute clarity of someone whose worst fear had just walked out of the dark and introduced itself that far enough was not as far as she had believed. She stepped back from the window. Her hands were shaking, but her face was set, and she made herself breathe one breath and then another. The counting. She always fell back on when the world tried to take her under. She looked around the kitchen, the warm stove, the organized pantry, the table that had started to feel like something she was allowed to stand near. She looked at Isaac in his crib. She was not going to lose this. She didn't know yet what this was, not fully, not in terms she could put words to, but she knew what it felt like. It felt like the first kitchen her grandmother had ever let her stand in. It felt like being necessary. It felt like the beginning of something that deserved a real chance. The truck outside idled in the dark. Abigail Moore picked up the long-handled wooden spoon from the stove and set it down again, because that was not what she needed, and then she stood in the middle of the kitchen and made herself think clearly. Because panic was a luxury she could not afford. Because her son was asleep 6 feet away. Because whatever was coming through that gate, and she already knew she intended to be standing on her own 2 feet when it arrived. The knock came at the front door, not the kitchen door. That told her everything she needed to know. Someone who came to the kitchen door was coming to visit. Someone who came to the front door was coming to make a point. Abigail stood in the kitchen hallway and listened to the knock echo through the house, 3 times slow and deliberate. The kind of knock that wasn't asking for permission, but announcing an intention. She heard boots on the upstairs landing and knew Ethan had heard it too. She heard his door open, his steps on the stairs, unhurried but alert. She stepped back into the kitchen and put herself between the hallway and Isaac's crib. She heard the front door open. She heard Ethan say, "Can I help you?" And she heard the voice that had lived in her nightmares for 4 years say, "I'm looking for my wife." The kitchen walls didn't move, but Abigail felt them move. She pressed one hand flat against the counter and breathed through her nose, 1 count, 2, 3, and kept her eyes on Isaac, who was still asleep, who did not yet understand what his father's voice meant, and she made herself a promise, standing right there, that he never would. Ethan's voice came back even and measured. "I don't know who you're talking about." "Abigail Vaughn, big woman. She's got my son with her." A pause. "My infant son who she took without my permission." "That's a serious accusation to make on a stranger's porch at this hour. I've got paperwork that makes it legal." The voice, Derek's voice, carried the specific confidence of a man who had learned that paperwork and volume could accomplish most of what he wanted without him having to work for it. "She's here. I can see the kitchen light. I know she's here." Abigail pushed off the counter and walked to the kitchen doorway. She stood there and looked down the hall at the open front door and at the 2 men framed in it, Ethan, with his hand on the door frame, and Derek Vaughn standing on the porch like a man who owned the ground he stood on and intended to collect what was on it. Derek saw her immediately. He smiled. It was not a good smile. It was the smile of a man who had been looking for something for a long time and had found it, and the finding mattered more to him than the thing itself ever had. "There she is," he said. Ethan didn't move from the doorway. "This, your husband," he said to Abigail. He said it quietly without inflection, but his hand on the doorframe had tightened. "Ex-husband," Abigail said, "in every way that matters." "The law says otherwise," Derek said pleasantly. "We're still legally married, Abigail, and that's still my son." "You need to step back off my porch," Ethan said. "I need to speak with my wife." "You need to step back off my porch," Ethan said again, and this time it wasn't a sentence with any flexibility in it. Derek's smile stayed, but something behind his eyes adjusted the way a man recalculates when he meets resistance he didn't anticipate. He was not a small man. He was broad and well-dressed in the way that money could make a man well-dressed, and he had the look of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through legitimate enough channels that nobody could ever quite pin him as the villain until it was too late. "I've got a county order," Derek said. He reached into his jacket. Ethan's hand moved slightly, just slightly, and Derek noticed and very carefully produced a folded paper rather than anything else. "Signed by Judge Whitmore in Abilene, granting me temporary custody of Isaac Vaughn pending a hearing." He held it out. "You want to tell me again to step off the porch?" Abigail's throat closed around something cold and solid. Ethan took the paper. He unfolded it with one hand and read it in the light from the hallway, and his face didn't change in any visible way, but something behind his eyes did. He refolded the paper. He held it back out to Derek. "Come back with the sheriff," he said. "During daylight hours. Anything that paper says gets handled with proper law enforcement present. That's not negotiation. That's how it's going to work." Derek didn't take the paper back immediately. He looked at Ethan the way he looked at all obstacles, as temporary inconveniences with a shelf life. "You're making a mistake getting involved in this," Derek said. "This is a domestic matter, a family matter." "You showed up uninvited at night to a man's property," Ethan said. "That makes it my matter. The sheriff's office opens at 8. I'd suggest you be there." Derek finally took the paper. He tucked it back in his jacket. His eyes found Abigail over Ethan's shoulder, and he held them there long enough to make sure she understood that the paper was only part of what he was carrying with him tonight. "I'll see you in court, Abigail," he said, as if it were a social engagement, as if it were pleasant. "Get some sleep." He turned and walked back to his truck, unhurried, the walk of a man who had not lost this yet, and intended to make sure she knew it. Ethan closed the door. He stood with his hand on it for a moment, his back to Abigail, and then he turned around. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She had not planned to say all of it. She had planned to give him the framework enough to explain the paper enough to explain why she'd run enough to justify the situation, without handing him her worst years on a plate in a kitchen that had only just started to feel like somewhere she was allowed to breathe. But Ethan Calloway sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with the particular quality of stillness that some men had, the kind that didn't fill the silence with questions or expressions, or the subtle pressure of needing her to shape the story around his comfort. And so she told him more than she planned. She told him about the first year, which had been ordinary enough that she told herself she was overreacting. The way he spoke to her in private, that he would never speak to her in public. The small destructions her friendships one by one. Her confidence. Her sense of what was normal. She told him about the year after that, which was less ordinary. She told him about the night 6 months ago when Derek had come home drunk and Isaac had been 2 weeks old and crying, and Derek had reached into the crib and she had put herself between them, and what had happened next had settled something in her that had been wavering for years. She wasn't going back. Not for any piece of paper, not for any lawyer, not for anything. The kitchen was very quiet by the time she finished. Ethan had not moved. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who was managing something behind his face that required significant management. "He put hands on you," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "While you were carrying Isaac?" "Yes." The muscle in his jaw worked once. "And this judge in Abilene," he said, "he gave Derek a custody order. Derek's family has money. They've given to Judge Whitmore's campaign twice." She said it without bitterness, just the flat fact of how the world worked. "I had a public defender who was handling 9 other cases." Ethan stood up. He went to the kitchen counter and stood with his back to her, both hands flat on the surface, and she watched his shoulders and the back of his neck and the particular rigidity of a man who was deciding something. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Ethan, you and Isaac are not leaving this ranch." He turned around and his face was composed in the deliberate way of someone who had made a decision and settled into it completely. "We're going to fight this." "It's not your fight," she said. "You're on my property. He showed up at my door. That makes it my fight." He held her gaze. "You got a lawyer." "I had a public defender who—" "I'll call Bill Reardon in the morning. He handled my wife's estate. He knows family law. He's good." He paused. "He's also not cheap. But that's my problem, not yours. I can't let you. Miss Moore." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You cooked for 12 people for 2 straight weeks and refused to take a cent. You fixed my pantry door and reorganized a kitchen that had been failing for a year and a half, and you did it without being asked. You can let me make one phone call." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "One phone call," she said. "One phone call," he agreed. She nodded once. Neither of them mentioned that one phone call was the beginning of something considerably larger than a phone call. Some things were better entered into gradually. What neither of them expected was Claire. She appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7 the following morning, still in her nightclothes, her hair undone and her face holding an expression that Abigail had not seen from her before, open, stripped of the careful architecture of teenage hostility, replaced with something raw and young and furious on someone else's behalf. "I heard," Claire said. Abigail looked at her, "Last night," Claire said. "I heard what you told Dad." She came into the kitchen fully and stood on the other side of the table from Abigail. "He hit you while you were pregnant." "Claire," Ethan started. "While she was pregnant with Isaac," Claire said again. Her voice was not breaking. It was the kind of voice that had decided not to break and was holding to that decision through sheer stubbornness. "And some judge is going to give him the baby because he has money." "We don't know that's going to happen," Ethan said. "But it could." Nobody answered that because it could, and they all knew it could, and the truth of that sat at the kitchen table with them like a fourth person nobody had invited. Claire looked at Abigail. "What do you need?" she said. Abigail blinked. What do you need? To fight him. What do you need?" Abigail opened her mouth, closed it, looked at this girl who had spent 2 weeks treating her like an inconvenience, who had carried her mother's absence like a wound she kept sealed, who had just heard the worst thing Abigail had survived, and come down to the kitchen, not with pity, but with her sleeves metaphorically rolled up. "Witnesses," Abigail said quietly. "People who saw what he was. He hid it well, but in 4 years there were moments. Neighbors, church people, his own workers." She paused. "And I need someone who knows where he kept Isaac's birth records, because the copies I have are in a bag he told the court I stole." Claire nodded, slowly processing. "I can ask Mrs. Hensley," she said. "She lives 2 properties over from wherever you came from, doesn't she? She knows everybody." "I don't know how you'd know." "Dad told me which county," Claire said simply. "I'm 16, not stupid." Abigail looked at her for a moment and felt something move through her chest, warm and careful and fragile, the way new things felt before they were ready to be held without both hands. "Thank you," she said. Claire picked up a piece of last night's cornbread from the cloth on the counter. She ate a bite of it standing up, looking at nothing in particular. "It's still not biscuits," she said. "No?" Abigail agreed. "Show me how you make the glaze," Claire said. "The molasses one." Abigail stood up and went to the stove. The crisis that broke the ranch wide open didn't come from Derek Vaughn. It came from the sky. 12 days after Derek showed up at the gate, a drought settled over the county with the indifference of a thing that didn't know or care what was happening to the people underneath it. 3 weeks without meaningful rain in a part of Texas that needed regular watering to keep a cattle operation viable. The creek that the North pasture relied on dropped to a trickle. 17 head of cattle had to be moved to a smaller, less productive pasture with limited shade. Feed costs spiked because the grazing wasn't there. And on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was the hard, bright, empty blue of a drought in its full confidence, a man in a truck from the Lone Star Bank arrived at the Callaway Ranch with a folder under his arm and the expression of a man who was sorry to be doing this and had done it enough times that the sorrow was mostly professional. Ethan came back into the kitchen afterward and sat down at the table and said nothing for a full minute. "Foreclosure notice," he said. 90 days. Abigail set down what she was holding. "How far short are you?" she said. He told her. The number was large enough that she had to work at not letting her expression change. "I'm paying for the lawyer," he said. "The drought's cutting cattle revenue. The repairs on the north fence I've been putting off can't be put off anymore. And Derek's lawyers have filed a motion that's going to cost money just to respond to." He looked at the table. "I shouldn't have told you that." "You should have," she said. "It's not your problem." "Ethan?" She waited until he looked at her. "Everything that happens to this ranch is my problem right now. You made it my problem when you told me to stay. I don't know if you understood what that meant when you said it, but I took it seriously." He looked at her. "The Sunday dinners," she said. "Pete told me the Hendersons asked. I've been thinking about it." "You can't cook your way out of a bank notice," he said. "Not alone," she agreed. "But a working kitchen is income that doesn't depend on rain." She moved to the counter and picked up the notebook she kept there, the one she'd been adding to slowly pages of notes and figures and ideas in her small, careful handwriting. She set it in front of him. 25 people at Sunday dinner. Reasonable rate per head. Add canned goods. I've been thinking about the tomato sauces, the bean mix things that can be jarred. Travelers on the road need food that lasts. There's a trade route 2 miles west. She tapped the notebook. This kitchen can be more than a kitchen. Ethan looked at the notebook. He didn't open it. "Abigail," he said. Something about the way he said her name made her still. "I got into this to help you," he said. "I don't want you building a plan to pay me back. That's not—" He stopped, started again. That's not what this is." The kitchen was very quiet. "What is it then?" she said, carefully, with both hands the way you held fragile things. He looked at the table for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said, honest and slow, the words of a man who had been alone long enough that honesty took effort again. "But it's not that." Abigail breathed in, breathed out. She picked up the notebook. "Look at the numbers anyway," she said. "Tell me what you think." He reached out and took it from her hand. Their fingers didn't quite touch. She turned back to the stove, and that was when Jimmy Pace came through the kitchen door at a pace that wasn't his normal pace, and the look on his face wasn't his normal look, and behind him came Pete Harlow and two other hands, and Jimmy said, "Derek Vaughn's car is parked outside the county courthouse in town. He's been in there an hour, and there's a reporter from the Abilene paper with him." The room shifted. Ethan was on his feet. "What kind of reporter?" he said. "The kind that's writing something down," Jimmy said. "Pete's cousin works at the diner across the street. She says Vaughn's been talking loud enough for people to hear, saying he's come to collect his stolen son from a ranch that's harboring his wife." Abigail's hands went still on the stove handle. Harboring. The word had a specific legal weight, she knew, because Derek had known how to use legal weight the way other men used fists. She turned around. "He's trying to change the story," she said, "before the hearing. If it's in the paper that a ranch took in a woman who ran with someone's child." She stopped. "It poisons the jury," Ethan said. Flat. Certain. "There's no jury in a custody hearing," Abigail said. "Just a judge. And if that judge reads in the local paper that Ethan Calloway is hiding a kidnapper." She stopped again. Her voice had tried to do something she wouldn't allow it to do. She restarted. "It doesn't just hurt my case, it hurts yours, the bank, everything." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Jimmy Pace looked at Ethan, then at Abigail. Then he said with the directness of a man who had decided something and wasn't going back on it, "What do you need us to do?" And Abigail Moore, who had spent 4 years believing that the only person she could count on was herself, looked at the faces around her, Jimmy and Pete and Ethan, and behind them in the doorway, Claire holding Isaac, because she'd come to find out what the noise was, and felt the ground beneath her feet change in a way she didn't have words for yet. She found them anyway. "I need you to tell the truth," she said. "All of you. Whatever you've seen since I've been here. Whatever you know about what this kitchen has been and what it hasn't been." She looked at each of them in turn. "Can you do that?" Jimmy cracked his knuckles. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me to do something useful for 3 weeks. Bill Reardon arrived the next morning with a leather briefcase worn soft at the corners and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough courtrooms to know that panic was the first thing you couldn't afford. He was 60-something, narrow in the shoulders, with wire-rimmed glasses. He kept pushing up his nose, and he shook Abigail's hand. The way people shook the hand of someone they'd already decided to take seriously, which was different from the way most people shook her hand, and she noticed the difference immediately. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, and listened to Abigail for 45 minutes, without interrupting once. When she finished, he pushed his glasses up and looked at his notes. "The custody order is temporary," he said. "That's important. Judge Whitmore issued it on Derek's petition, which means it's based entirely on Derek's version of events. Our job between now and the hearing is to give the court a different version, a truer version." He paused. "The newspaper is the first problem." "He's already talking," Ethan said. "Then we talk first." Bill looked at Abigail. "I need everything. Medical records if you have them. Any documentation of the abuse, police reports, hospital visits, anything at all." "There aren't police reports," she said. "I never called." Bill nodded slowly. He had expected this. "Witness testimony becomes primary then. Anyone who saw anything, a neighbor who heard, a friend he made a mistake in front of." He waited. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Caroline Dupree. She lived next door to us in Haskell. She brought us a casserole once when I had a bruised eye, and he told her I'd walked into a cabinet door. She looked at me for a long time before she left. Abigail paused. The way she looked at me, she knew. I think she always knew. You think she'd testify? I think she'd been waiting to be asked. Bill wrote the name down. Anyone else? His foreman, Abigail said. Tom Briggs. He saw Derek grab me once in the yard. Derek passed it off as a joke, said I'd been startled. Tom didn't laugh. She looked at her hands. And there's a woman at the Haskell First Baptist, Ruth Albright. She ran their women's ministry. I tried to talk to her once early on before I understood how completely Derek had arranged things. She told me to pray harder. Abigail's voice stayed even. But 3 months before I left, she came to find me after a Sunday service and put a card in my hand, a domestic crisis hotline. She didn't say a word, just put it in my hand and walked away. She witnessed something, Bill said. She witnessed him in the parking lot after I'd said something he didn't like, Abigail said. He got a hold of my arm and smiled through it the entire time like we were laughing. She was 10 feet away loading groceries into her car. Bill wrote both names. He looked at his list for a moment. This is buildable, he said. It's not easy, but it's buildable. Jimmy Pace appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which was unusual for Jimmy, who generally treated doorways as things to walk through rather than stand in. If it helps, Jimmy said. I've got something to say about the kind of woman who shows up at a ranch she's never seen half frozen with a 6-week-old baby and cooks breakfast for 12 people before she's had a full night's sleep. He looked at Bill. That a thing a court listens to? Character witness, Bill said. Yes, a court absolutely listens to that. Jimmy nodded once. Then I'll be there. Behind him, Pete Harlow said, Me too. And behind Pete, 2 more hands said the same thing, overlapping each other slightly, in the specific way that people spoke when they'd already made up their minds before they opened their mouths. Abigail looked at them all. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise a long time ago about crying in front of people she needed to be strong in front of, and she kept her promises. But something moved across her face that everyone in the kitchen saw, and nobody mentioned, because some things were more powerful for being unnamed. Thank you, she said. All of you. Jimmy put his hat back on. Don't thank us yet, he said. Thank us when it's done. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, the Calloway Ranch became something it had not been since before Margaret Calloway died purposeful. Alive in a specific directed way, the way things are alive when people inside them are working toward something that matters. Bill Reardon made 4 trips to Haskell County and came back each time with something. Mrs. Caroline Dupree, it turned out, had kept a journal. Not for any legal purpose, just the habit of a woman who processed the world by writing it down. And in that journal were 3 separate entries describing what she had seen and heard through the shared wall of their houses and the fence between their yards. Tom Briggs agreed to testify with the resigned expression of a man who had been carrying a guilty conscience for 2 years and was relieved to set it down. Ruth Albright sent a written statement with a handwritten note at the bottom that said, "Only I should have done this sooner. I'm sorry." Derek's lawyers responded by filing a motion to have Abigail evaluated for mental fitness. Bill filed a counter-motion before the week was out. Derek's lawyers subpoenaed Ethan's financial records, arguing that a ranch facing foreclosure was not a stable environment for a child. Bill filed a motion arguing that Derek's history of financial control, documented in Abigail's account of how he had managed their joint accounts, kept her without access to money, and isolated her from employment, was the more relevant financial pattern of behavior. It went back and forth like that, the legal equivalent of a fistfight conducted in paperwork, and Abigail watched it from her kitchen and cooked through all of it, because cooking was the thing that kept her thinking straight when everything else tried to make her spiral. It was Claire who broke the newspaper problem. She did it in the most direct way imaginable, which was to walk into the office of the Abilene paper with a folder of photographs. Photographs she'd taken herself on the disposable camera she'd found in her mother's old things, showing the Calloway kitchen in full operation. The workers at the table, Isaac in his box by the stove, the pantry organized and full, the dining table set for 12. She sat down across from the reporter who had been writing Derek's version of the story, and she said, "I'm Ethan Calloway's daughter, and I'm 16 years old, and I want to tell you what's actually happening at my family's ranch." The reporter, a woman in her 40s named Sandra Greer, who had been doing this long enough to recognize a story, when it introduced itself, listened to every word Claire said. The article ran on a Friday. It wasn't the story Derek had been feeding. It was a story about a woman who had shown up in a storm and given a struggling ranch its table back. It talked to Jimmy Pace, who said, and this ran in the paper in full, "I've been eating food. Somebody cooked me out of obligation for 2 years. I forgot what food tasted like when it was cooked by somebody who meant it." It talked to Pete Harlow, who said the kitchen had done more for the morale of the ranch in 3 weeks than anything in the last year and a half. It talked to Claire, who said very carefully, with the precision of someone who had thought out exactly what she wanted on record, "She never asked us for a single thing except a chance to cook one meal. Everything else she gave us." Abigail read the article at the kitchen table on a Friday morning with Isaac in her lap, and did not speak for a long time after. Ethan sat across from her and waited. "Claire did that," she said finally. "Claire did that," he confirmed. Abigail looked down at Isaac. "She's going to be extraordinary," she said, quiet and certain. "She already is," Ethan said. "She just needed something to be extraordinary for." The Sunday dinners started on the third weekend because the kitchen needed to earn, while the legal fight burned through everything around it. Abigail had planned for 25. 31 people came. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for more than this. Because she had learned to cook for uncertainty the way other people budgeted for it. And the table in the Calloway kitchen was extended with 2 sawhorses and a plank that Jimmy Pace produced from the barn, covered with a cloth that Claire found in her mother's linen chest and ironed without being asked. It was not a formal dining experience. It was beans and smoked beef and biscuits. Real biscuits made by Abigail and Claire side by side in the kitchen that morning. Claire's hands quick and practiced in a way she'd been hiding her grandmother's recipe pulled from memory, with the particular reverence of something you don't know you've kept until you reach for it, and 3 kinds of pie that Abigail had been working on since Wednesday. People sat wherever there was room. They passed dishes the way families passed dishes. They talked to strangers the way people talk to strangers, when the food is good enough to require comment, and the food required comment. By the end of the meal, 4 people had asked about the following Sunday. One woman asked if the canned tomato sauce she'd tasted in the beans was available to buy. A man who ran a supply depot 15 miles down the road said he had a shelf he'd been trying to fill with local product and he'd be interested in talking. Abigail wrote down every name. That night, after the kitchen was clean and Isaac was down and the ranch was quiet, she sat at the table with her notebook and did the math carefully, the way she always did, the math honestly, without rounding up in her favor, without the optimism that hoped and the pessimism that sabotaged. She added the dinner income. She estimated the jarred goods conservatively. She projected 3 months forward. She set the notebook down. She sat back. It wasn't enough to save the ranch alone, but it was enough to be part of saving it. She left the notebook open on the table where Ethan would see it in the morning. He found it before she was up. She heard him come downstairs, heard the kitchen chair pull out, heard the silence of a man reading numbers he hadn't expected. When she came in with Isaac at 6:30, Ethan was still at the table with the notebook in front of him, and the expression of someone who had been looking at something long enough to trust it. "This is real?" he said. "It's conservative," she said. "It could be more." "Abigail." He looked up. "This is real." She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and looked at the notebook between them, like the thing it was not just numbers, but proof of something. Proof that the kitchen could carry weight. That she could carry weight. That what she had to offer was not charity and not sentiment, but something with actual value in the world. "The bank meeting is Tuesday," Ethan said. "I know. I'm taking this." He touched the notebook. "I was hoping you would." He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, the length of time it took to consider saying something and decide not to, The way you decided not to touch something fragile before you were sure of your hands." "Thank you," he said. "You said something like that to me once before," she said. "I told you to wait until there was something to thank me for." "There's something to thank you for," he said. She let herself hold that for a moment. Just a moment. "Tell me how the meeting goes," she said. "I'll have dinner ready when you get back." The hearing arrived the way important things arrive too fast and too slow at the same time the days before it, both endless and gone before she was ready. She wore her best dress, which was the only dress she owned that wasn't the flannel and skirt she'd been borrowing, a dark blue cotton she'd bought second-hand in Abilene on a Thursday when Ethan had taken her to town for supplies and waited in the truck without being asked to. She had pressed it the night before with the iron she'd found in the linen closet. She carried Isaac in her left arm and her folder of documents in her right, and she walked into the Haskell County Courthouse beside Bill Reardon with her head up. Derek was already there. He had 2 lawyers. They wore suits that cost more than the Callaway Ranch's monthly feed bill. They smiled at each other with the ease of people who expected to win. Derek looked at Abigail across the courtroom and did the thing he always did, assessed her, found her wanting, dismissed her. He looked at her size and her second-hand dress and her baby on her arm, and the rancher's hands behind her, and he made the same calculation he had always made, which was that she was less than him, and would remain less than him because the world was arranged to confirm his position. He had always been wrong about her. He just hadn't understood it yet. Mrs. Caroline Dupree took the stand first. She was a small woman in her 60s with white hair and the contained, careful manner of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to say and intended to say it without deviation. She answered Bill's questions in full sentences, one at a time, and she looked at Derek while she spoke, not with anger, but with the specific composed eye contact of a woman who had been quiet for too long and had made peace with that, and was done with it now. She described what she had seen. She described the journal entries which were entered as evidence. She described the night she had brought the casserole and looked into Abigail's eye and known the way neighbors know the way women know what a cabinet door does not do to a person's face. Derek's lawyers objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Tom Briggs testified next. He was brief and direct the way men who work with their hands tended to be direct, and he described what he had seen in the yard, with the economy of someone who understood that unnecessary words diluted the ones that mattered. Ruth Albright's written statement was read aloud, and then Claire Calloway walked to the witness stand. She was 16 years old. She was wearing her mother's pearl earrings, which Abigail hadn't known she owned until that morning, and she sat with the posture of someone who had decided that this room was not going to be larger than her. Derek's lawyer stood up to address her. "Miss Calloway," he said, pleasant and careful the way people were pleasant and careful when they intended to undermine you. "You've known Mrs. Vaughn for what, 3 weeks?" "Abigail Moore," Claire said. The lawyer paused. "Excuse me. Her name is Abigail Moore. She hasn't been Vaughn in any way that matters since before I met her." Claire looked at him with the steady composure of someone who had decided exactly how much of this she was going to allow. "And yes, 3 weeks. But some people you know for 30 years and learn nothing real about them. 3 weeks with someone who's real is enough." The lawyer tried a different approach. "Isn't it true that Miss Moore arrived at your family's home with no money, no identification?" "She arrived in a storm," Claire said. "She'd been left stranded on a highway in sleet with a 6-week-old baby. What she had was her son and the ability to do something extraordinary with what was in front of her. That's more than most people have." She looked at the judge. "In the 3 weeks Abigail Moore has been at my family's ranch, she has fed 12 people every single day. She has not asked for a single thing that wasn't necessary. She has not once put herself before Isaac, and she has been more of a real presence in that house than—" She stopped. She steadied. "Than anything we've had in a long time. She didn't take anything from anyone. She gave. That's what she does. That's who she is." The courtroom was quiet. Derek was looking at Claire with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to something colder. The specific look of a man recalculating against an opponent he'd underestimated. and Abigail sitting behind Bill Reardon at the plaintiff's table with Isaac warm and sleeping in her arms, looked at that expression on Derek's face and felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked for a very long time, because for the first time in 4 years, she was not alone in that room. For the first time in 4 years, she had people standing beside her who had chosen to be there. Not because they had to, not because they owed her, not because she had made herself small enough or useful enough or quiet enough, but because she was Abigail Moore, and she had cooked them real food and told them real things and stayed when it would have been easier to run. She held Isaac a little closer. The judge called a recess, and outside in the courthouse hallway, while the lawyers talked strategy, and Claire stood against the wall with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a woman who had just done the most important thing she'd ever done and knew it. Ethan Calloway sat down beside Abigail on the hard wooden bench and said nothing at all. He just sat next to her, close enough that his shoulder was near hers, close enough that the warmth of another person reached her in the cold, echoing hallway. And Abigail, who had been keeping herself upright on will and habit, and the practiced endurance of someone who had learned not to lean on anything because things tended to move when you leaned on them, let herself rest, just slightly, just for a moment. She felt him notice. She felt him not move. She felt him very deliberately stay exactly where he was. "Whatever happens in there," he said low and even, "you're not leaving that ranch alone." She didn't answer right away. "Ethan, I mean it," he said. "I said it before. I'm saying it again. You and Isaac, you have a place. Whatever that judge decides today doesn't change what I'm telling you right now." Abigail looked at her son's sleeping face. She thought about all the places she had told herself were temporary. All the tables she had fed people at that were never going to be hers. All the kitchens she'd stood in, and all the doors she'd kept 1 foot near because she'd learned that in her life, exits were something you located before you needed them. "You should know something," she said quietly. "I don't know how to stop working. I don't know how to be somewhere without earning it. I've tried to learn, and I haven't managed it yet." "That's all right," Ethan said. "I'm saying it might be frustrating. I've been running a cattle ranch through a drought with a teenager and a failing ledger," he said. "I've got a high tolerance for frustrating." She laughed, a short, real sound, not the broken one from the storm. A different kind. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been carefully not looking at her for 3 weeks, and she looked back with the steadiness of a woman who had decided she was done being afraid of the things she wanted. The door to the courtroom opened. Bill Reardon appeared in the hallway with his briefcase under his arm and his glasses pushed up his nose, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who had just won something he'd been working hard to earn. "They're ready for us," he said. Abigail stood up. She straightened her dress. She held her son against her shoulder. And she walked back into that courtroom the way she had walked into every kitchen she had ever claimed, with her head up and her hands ready and the full grounded certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were worth. The judge was a woman. Abigail had not known this until she walked back into that courtroom and saw her seated at the bench, a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with gray at her temples, and the expression of someone who had listened to a great deal of human trouble over the years and had learned to hear what was said between the words, not just the words themselves. Judge Patricia Morse looked at the courtroom over her reading glasses and called the session to order without ceremony, without preamble, in the direct way of a person who had no interest in performing the weight of the moment, because the moment already had enough weight of its own. Derek's lawyers arranged themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had counted their advantages and found the number satisfying. Bill Reardon set his briefcase on the table and opened it, and did not look at Derek's lawyers at all. Abigail held Isaac against her chest and sat very still. Judge Morse read from her notes for a moment. Then she set them down and looked at the room. "I've reviewed the testimony and evidence submitted in this matter," she said. "I've reviewed the original petition for temporary custody and the counter-filing. I've read the witness statements and the documentation provided by both parties." She paused. "I want to address something before I render my decision." Derek's lead lawyer shifted in his seat. The original petition for temporary custody was granted on the basis of Mr. Vaughn's claim that his wife had removed the child from the home without consent and without legal justification. Judge Morse looked at Derek directly. The evidence presented in this proceeding suggests a substantially different picture. The testimony of Mrs. Caroline Dupree, Mr. Thomas Briggs, and the written statement of Mrs. Ruth Albright, taken together, describes a pattern of behavior in the Vaughn household that was not disclosed in the original petition. That omission was significant. Derek's jaw tightened. "I am dismissing the temporary custody order," Judge Morse said, "effective immediately." The air in the room changed. It didn't change loudly. It changed the way pressure changes when a door opens, a release, a shift. Something that had been held in one position for too long, finally allowed to move. Abigail felt it in her chest before she understood it in her mind, and she pressed her hand flat against Isaac's back and breathed. Bill Reardon was writing something on his legal pad with the focused, unhurried manner of a man who had expected this and was recording it correctly. Derek stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Vaughn." Judge Morse's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You will have the opportunity to seek a formal custody arrangement through proper channels in the appropriate jurisdiction. What you will not do is circumvent this court's process by arriving at a woman's location at night with a document obtained through incomplete disclosure. I trust I'm being clear." Derek's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Derek sat back down. Abigail did not look at him. She had decided before she walked into the courtroom that she was not going to spend any part of this moment looking at Derek Vaughn, and she kept that decision. She looked at Judge Morse. She looked at Bill, who was still writing. She looked down at Isaac, who was awake now and looking at the ceiling of the courtroom with the serene philosophical expression of a baby encountering fluorescent lighting for the first time. "You're okay," she told him very quietly. "We're okay." He grabbed her finger with his whole fist. Outside the courthouse, the Texas afternoon hit them all at once. The heat, the light, the particular smell of a summer day that had been going on without them while they were inside negotiating the shape of their future. Claire was the first one out the door, and she stopped on the steps and turned around and looked at Abigail coming through behind Bill Reardon, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Claire crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and put her arms around Abigail and Isaac both, and held on hard the way teenagers held on when they had run out of ways to be controlled about something. Abigail wrapped her free arm around Claire's shoulders and held back. "You didn't have to do what you did in there," Abigail said. "Yes, I did," Claire said into her shoulder. "Don't argue with me about it." "I'm not arguing." "Good." They stood like that for a moment on the courthouse steps while the sun came down on them, and Jimmy Pace and Pete Harlow stood a respectful distance away with their hats in their hands and the satisfied expressions of men who had shown up to do something useful and had done it. Ethan stood behind them all, and when Abigail looked up and found him, he was looking at her with an expression she had been noticing more often in recent weeks, an expression that he didn't try to rearrange when she caught it the way he might have in the beginning. He just let her see it, whatever it was. She thought she was beginning to know what it was. Jimmy Pace put his hat back on. "You all ready to go home?" he said. Home. The word landed differently than it used to. Abigail looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." The months that followed did not move quickly. That was the first thing Abigail learned about the kind of healing that was worth anything. It moved slowly, and it looked like ordinary things. It looked like Sunday mornings in the kitchen with the stove already going. It looked like Isaac learning to roll over on the braided rug beside the hearth, while Claire sat nearby pretending to read, but actually watching him with the particular expression she wore when she was letting herself care about something and had given up fighting it. It looked like the ranch hands arriving for dinner and staying an extra 20 minutes some evenings, not for the food, but for the noise of it, the warmth of people in a room together. The Sunday dinners grew. The 3rd week drew 40 people. The 4th week, Abigail ran out of biscuits by 6:30, and Claire made another batch without being asked, moving through the kitchen with her mother's efficiency and her own confidence the two things merging in her hands into something that was entirely hers. By the 6th week, people were driving from 2 counties over, and a retired couple from a town 20 miles east told Abigail she was the best cook they'd had since a restaurant they used to go to in San Antonio. Closed its doors in 1987, and Abigail wrote that down in her notebook, not because she was collecting compliments, but because specificity mattered, and that was the kind of specific thing a person should remember. The jarred goods happened gradually, the way the right things tended to happen, not from a plan, but from necessity. The supply depot man, whose name was Earl Hutchins, and who turned out to be both reliable and fair in a way that was rarer than it should have been, took 12 cases of tomato sauce on a Wednesday and asked for 24 the following week. Abigail began teaching Claire to can in the evenings, the two of them at the kitchen counter with their sleeves pushed up and the radio on low, working through the process with the rhythm of people who had figured out how to be in the same space. "You measure by feel," Claire said one evening, watching Abigail adjust the seasoning without consulting anything. "I measure by taste," Abigail said. "Here." She offered the spoon. Claire tasted it, considered it. "Needs more pepper." "It does," Abigail agreed. Claire added the pepper. She tasted it again, nodded. "How did you know to do this?" Claire said. "All of it, not just the cooking, the business part of it." "I didn't always know," Abigail said. "I learned by trying things that didn't work and figuring out why they didn't, and trying again." She looked at the jar she was filling. "That's most of it. Most of learning anything worth knowing." Claire was quiet for a moment. She wiped her hands on her apron. "She would have liked you," she said. She said it the way she always said things she meant, deeply, quickly, without looking up, as if speed made it easier to carry. "My mother." Abigail did not answer immediately. She knew better than to answer a thing like that immediately. "Tell me something she did," Abigail said quietly. "In this kitchen." Claire looked up. "Something she made," Abigail said. "Or something she said, something real." Claire thought about it. Something softened in her face, the careful teenage armor coming down the way it only came down in the kitchen these days, incrementally, willingly, in the warmth of a room that had learned how to hold people again. "She used to sing," Claire said. "Badly. She knew she was bad at it, and she did it anyway, and she'd laugh at herself while she did it." She paused. "I haven't heard music in this kitchen in a long time." Abigail reached over and turned the radio up slightly. Claire stared at her for a second. Then she laughed. The genuine, unguarded laugh of a 16-year-old girl who had forgotten she still knew how to make that sound. The bank meeting with Ethan had gone better than the numbers alone would have suggested, because numbers on paper were one thing, and a man who could look a banker in the eye and show him a working kitchen with consistent revenue and a growing customer base was another thing entirely. The foreclosure notice was put on a modified payment arrangement, not gone, not fixed, but manageable in the way that difficult things became manageable when you stopped trying to solve them all at once and started solving the next piece. The cattle recovered when the rain finally came in late summer. A long, slow soaking that the ground drank without rushing the way the land recovered when it was finally allowed to. The north pasture came back. The creek came back. The feed costs dropped. And the kitchen kept going quietly, steadily. Sunday after Sunday, jar after jar, the kind of income that didn't make anyone rich, but made the ground beneath them a little more solid with every passing week. Derek filed for formal custody proceedings in Haskell County in September. Bill Reardon filed a counter-petition citing domestic violence, and the evidence from the first hearing, along with 3 additional witnesses they had located in the months since, people who had seen things and said nothing at the time, and were no longer willing to say nothing. The formal hearing was scheduled for November. It never happened. 2 weeks before the date, Bill called Ethan's phone at 7 in the morning, and Ethan brought the phone to Abigail in the kitchen without a word and held it out. She took it. "Derek's dropped the petition," Bill said. "He withdrew it this morning. His lawyer filed the paperwork at 8. Abigail stood very still. "Why?" she said. "My best guess." Bill's voice was measured the way it was when he was being careful with someone. "One of the additional witnesses we located was his own sister. She'd been prepared to testify about an incident she witnessed 3 years ago. Derek's lawyers would have known what that testimony looked like and what it meant for any future custody claim. He paused. He decided the math didn't work in his favor. The kitchen was full of morning light. Isaac was in his seat at the end of the table, batting at a wooden spoon that Claire had tied to the edge of the tray for him, making the determined, concentrated noises of a baby engaged in what he considered serious work. "It's over," Abigail said. Not a question. "In terms of the custody fight, yes," Bill said. "He can file again in the future, but the record now makes that a significant undertaking. I don't think he will." She thanked him. She handed the phone back to Ethan. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface, the same surface she had sat at on the first night planning breakfast, counting cans, building something out of whatever was in front of her. Ethan sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Isaac knocked the wooden spoon off his tray and looked at where it had gone with an expression of profound surprise. "Bah," he said. It was a sound he'd been making for a week without apparent direction, but this time he looked straight at Ethan when he said it. Something shifted in Ethan's face. Abigail watched it. Shift. Watched the thing behind his eyes that he was always managing. Come all the way to the surface for just a moment. Unmanaged, real, the specific expression of a man who had not expected to be looked at that way by a child, and did not know what to do with how much it meant. He cleared his throat. "He's been doing that all week," Abigail said gently. "I know," Ethan said. "Does it—" She paused. "Careful with it. Does it bother you?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me." Isaac picked up the spoon from where it had fallen and hit the tray with it triumphantly. Ethan looked at the baby. He looked at the table. He looked at Abigail with the same expression he'd been letting her see for months now, the one he'd stopped trying to rearrange. "There's something I've been meaning to say," he said. "Ethan, let me say it," he said. "Not demanding, just asking." She waited. "I've been alone in this house for 3 years," he said. "I don't mean physically alone. I mean the other kind." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The kind where you're surrounded by people, and you're still so far inside yourself you can't get out. I didn't know that was what I was until you walked into my kitchen and made it mean something again." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not saying this right." "You're saying it fine," she said. "I'm saying that I don't want you to stay because you feel you owe me anything. I don't want you to stay because you need a safe place, although I want you to have a safe place." He looked at her. "I want you to stay because I'd like to know what it looks like, you and me, when neither of us is managing a crisis. When it's just ordinary. I want to know what ordinary looks like with you in it." The kitchen held that for a moment. Abigail looked at this man, this quiet, difficult, decent man who had pulled her off a fence line in a storm and given her a kitchen and stood beside her in a courthouse and never once made her feel like something he'd taken in out of pity. Who had let her cook and let her plan and let her earn and never made her small for needing any of it. Who sat across from her now with his heart right there on the table between them, offered without performance, without strategy, with nothing but the plain honesty of someone who had decided it was time. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "Neither am I. I have opinions about kitchens. I've noticed. Strong opinions. About how food should be made and how tables should be set and who should be allowed to eat at them." "You can have all the opinions you want," he said. "I've been eating cold cornbread alone for 1.5 years. I'm not in a position to argue." She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed, looked at her the way she had almost forgotten a person could look at another person. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "Ordinary," she said. "Let's try ordinary." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Isaac banged the spoon on the tray. The winter came in November, the way Texas winters came. Not with the dramatic violence of northern cold, but with a slow, settling chill that moved into the walls of the house and stayed. The dining table was full now, Every night workers and family together. And on Sunday afternoons the kitchen expanded to hold whoever came down the road, because Abigail's table had become a known thing in the county. Not famous, not a destination exactly, but the kind of known thing that spread the way. Real things spread through one person, telling another that they'd eaten somewhere and felt for a few hours entirely themselves. It was a Wednesday evening in December when Claire said it. She said it by accident, which was the only way it could have been said and meant anything. She was reaching past Abigail for the salt moving through the kitchen, the way she moved through it now, with total ownership, without hesitation, as fluent in this space as she was in any room she'd grown up in. And she said without thinking, without weight, in the casual and complete way of a person whose mind had already settled something their mouth was just now announcing, "Mom, where did you put the good ladle?" The kitchen went still. Not the whole kitchen, just the air between them. Claire froze. Abigail kept her hands on what she was doing. She did not make it large. She did not make it small. She let it be exactly what it was. "Cabinet to the left of the stove," she said. "Second shelf." Claire found the ladle. She did not say anything else. Neither did Abigail. But later, when the kitchen was clean and quiet, and Isaac was asleep, and Ethan was reading by the fire, and Claire had gone upstairs, Abigail stood alone for a moment in the kitchen and pressed both hands to the